How to strengthen your pelvic floor. Have you ever wanted to strengthen your pelvic floor and you've tried kegels and they haven't worked? I know, they definitely don't work, or at least they don't work to the extent that you need them to work for what your pelvic floor is supposed to be doing. Today, I want to share with you one of my ways that I like to strengthen the pelvic floor and tell you these 4 ways in which you can strengthen your pelvic floor so you can stop leaking, have pain-free intimacy, and return to that pre-baby body without kegels. Now, the first thing that you should know is that we are pulling this from the No Kegels University method. And this particular method has 4 phases itself, and I'm going to be teaching you phase 3 today. So for reference, phase 1 is oh my gosh, I don't know why I'm struggling today. So for reference, phase 1 is your tissues moving and moving well. Phase 2 is getting your pressure system intact. And then phase 3 is strength using the VAB3 principles. And phase 4 is maintenance mode. And today I'm going to share with you phase 3, strength through the VAB3 principles. Now, I will tell you that if you have not worked on phase 1 or phase 2, it may not be the best idea for you to start working on phase 3, but I am a woman of action. I want you to be a woman of action as well. And so here are some of those pieces that you can use. So the VAB3 method, it's VAB3, and it's an acronym for vertical, above the pelvis, below the pelvis, and all 3 planes. Now, to understand where this came from, I don't want to say that I necessarily was the one who created this, because what I did was I took a look at the pelvic floor and all the things that it does and all the things that it should be doing. And that's where I figured out, oh, well, if that's what the pelvic floor is supposed to be doing, if that's how the pelvic floor is supposed to function, then if we take those principles and utilize that as part of the strengthening, we're really letting nature be the one that decides how we should be strengthening our pelvic floor. So V stands for vertical. Vertical means that it's essentially up and down motion, right? So when we jump up and down, when we sneeze, that downward pressure, that vertical pressure, our pelvic floor contracts against our urethra, where the urine comes out, so that we don't leak. So think of it like someone standing at the end of a hose and putting their heel on the bottom, or at the end of that hose, and then next thing you know, there's no more water coming out. That's exactly what's happening, assuming that our pelvic floor is strong enough to be able to squeeze against it. So we are going to be using vertical motion as part of our principles to strengthen that pelvic floor. The second is above the pelvis. So one of the things that you should know is that our pelvis is much like Grand Central Station. So when we land a step, if we bend over, any movement that we're doing, our pelvis is the one that's transferring load. And so if we increase load in any capacity, our pelvis and our pelvic floor is now working. So we can know that if I raise my arm overhead, which for above the pelvis, that's how I like to simplify it, is rather than thinking, oh, we need to do a weight overhead or, use the arm overhead, I feel like matches up with that A for above the pelvis. So again, using that arm overhead, that is a principle that we can rely on to know that our pelvic floor is working. Now, B is for below the pelvis. And this is referencing that whenever the hip is working in a standing, or I don't even want to say upright position, but even a bridge where we're bearing weight, we're putting weight through our foot or our leg, whatever that hip is doing, that pelvic floor is following. And I want that to be how you remember B for below the pelvis. So anytime we're standing or walking or squatting where that hip is working, because remember, whatever the hip does or doesn't do, it decides what the pelvic floor does or doesn't do, then we can count on the fact that our pelvic floor is working with that hip too. And then 3 stands for all 3 planes of motion. Now, one of the most interesting things about the pelvic floor is that it is the only group of muscles in the body that has fibers that run in all three planes. That's front to back, it's side to side, and then diagonal or rotational. So also think about this for a moment too. We are 3D individuals living in a 3D world. So if you had to guess what the most important muscle group is for us to function in our daily life, I would think the pelvic floor too. You're right. So while I know I very well might be biased, I feel like that fact alone represents and should place a lot of emphasis on why the pelvic floor is so important. So knowing that we have fibers that run in all three planes, then we're going to utilize that front to back, side to side, diagonal and rotational as part of the principles in which we're going to strengthen our pelvic floor. So those are a lot of principles. There's 4. So how do you know how to use them? The rule of thumb I'd like to come up with is that as long as you have at least 2 of the 4 principles, the VAB3 principles, then you can count that as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise. And the reason that I have said I decided to like at least 2 is because you could say, well, I'm walking and I'm working my pelvic floor. Now, yes, but it's one of those that we want this strengthening to be well-rounded. We want our bodies to have a variety of strengthening. So if you're saying, well, I walk every day, I'm totally strengthening my pelvic floor, that may not necessarily be true because you're missing out on all those 3 planes of motion. You're missing out on increasing that load overhead or that arm overhead. So I just think that it's important to remember that you need at least 2 of the 4 principles. So now how do we put this into practice? The beautiful thing about this, or at least I hope that you have this takeaway by the time you get done watching this or listening to it, is that many of the things that you're doing already probably is a pelvic floor strengthening exercise, or you just need to add a few extra pieces to it to change it up. So let me give you a couple of ideas of things you might be doing already. Yoga. Yoga is typically a pretty good representation of working your pelvic floor. And the other thing that I'm going to add here too is you don't need to be tightening your muscles while you're doing yoga because you're strengthening your pelvic floor. The beautiful thing about this is that this is how the body works naturally and physiologically. And so the pelvic floor is already working as long as you have 2 of those 4 principles. So in yoga, if you're in warrior 1, right, you're lunging forward and then maybe you move your arm. Well, now we could call that B for below the pelvis, right, because you're lunging. And then if you think about all the different warrior poses, your feet are turned. So you're getting some of those all 3 planes. And then if you think about some of those yoga poses where maybe you're in warrior 1 and then you'll reach that arm overhead while you're still lunging. Well, now we have the A in conjunction with the 3 for all 3 planes. We're using our hips, and then now we can count that as a B. So we have A, B, and 3 as part of that for our pelvic floor strengthening exercise. Now, I wouldn't rely entirely on using just yoga, but it's something that you could say, okay, well, maybe I enjoy doing yoga. Okay, you can count that as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise for that day. Now, another one that I get asked a lot of is running a pelvic floor strengthening exercise. And for the purposes of where we're trying to strengthen this pelvic floor, because it's obviously not doing what it should, right? Like if we're leaking or we're having pain with intimacy or we're struggling with prolapse or all these things, I would not count running as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise, and here's why. Now, while it has the vertical motion, right, like the up and down as you're running, and while you're using the B for below the pelvis, it's also just 1 plane only. And so this is one of those where you could make an argument, and I don't want you to really get stuck in the weeds, but here's the other thing I would say to you. If you're running and you're counting that as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise, and that's all you're doing all week, then I would say, well, obviously that is not enough. Maybe you need to go back to the beginning and work on phase 1, getting your tissues moving and moving well, and then move on to phase 2. But here's the other thing I would take a look at also is hold your workouts from a global view against the VAB3 principles. So if you're just running, well, that's vertical and then that's B. Are you getting in your workouts during that week, are you getting any other combinations of exercise or movement or physical activity that comes up with at least 2 of the 4 of those principles? Because you're not getting any above the pelvis or arm overhead, and you're not getting any all 3 planes, right? Running is just one plane. Then that's how you might be able to take a look at that and kind of decide. Because while you could easily, like I said, you could easily make an argument that running is a pelvic floor strengthening exercise using the VAB3 principles, you can also take a step back and have a global view and say, okay, how do my workouts look? You know, if you have a like a running workout 3 times a week and then you're not doing anything else on the other days, well, maybe you could, I'm not saying you have to throw yoga in because we talked about it already, but maybe there's some other things that you could be doing on your rest days from running. Now, hiking is another one that I actually suggest that could be a pelvic floor strengthening exercise, because when you're hiking, and when I say hiking, I mean you're not on a paved path walking and it's not very strenuous. Hiking, I mean like you're hiking up a hill and you're hiking down a hill. I would count that because you're using B for below, right? We're using our legs. And as you're having to traverse across the mountain or the path, you're probably having to move in all 3 planes, right? You're going up the mountain, you're going down the mountain. You might have to step off to the side over this rock or step over a branch. That is asking that pelvic floor to work quite a bit more. So I would actually count that. And then the other piece too, depending on how steep the hill is, it is a different type of load for the vertical. So you're getting the V, the B, and the 3. So these are some of the common ones that happen that I get asked about or I suggest. Another one that comes to mind is like a cardio class. Here in Utah, a lot of women like to go to High Fitness and they'll ask me, well, wouldn't that qualify? Because it's vertical and it's right because you're jumping all over the place and we're using our legs. Wouldn't that qualify? And that's another one that feels a little tricky to me. And the reason is because for that length of time, I know, I'm probably being a little picky about this. I don't know if I would count every class as a height, like an exercise or group fitness class like that as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise. And again, here's why. Just like with running, you can make that same argument. Well, now we have vertical, now we have B. But the thing is depending on the types of songs that you're doing, I don't know if you've ever done, there's certain choreography that go to certain songs in High Fitness, or if you're taking a step aerobics class, which is a really great way to strengthen that pelvic floor because you have that vertical and you're doing the O step and the W step and then the, I think there's like a T step that's the vertical, it's the B for below, and it's all 3 planes. But when you're doing like a cardio fitness class of sorts, you may not be getting all 3 planes. So again, that's where you can go kind of take a step back and say, okay, well, let's look at my week and see. If all I'm doing all week is this cardio fitness class or High Fitness or whatever it is, and I want you to do things that you enjoy. I don't think that you have to say, oh, that's not working my pelvic floor, I better scrap that. I don't mean that at all. What I mean is again, kind of taking that global view. If you're doing if you're counting High Fitness or a cardio fitness class 2 times a week and you're counting that as your pelvic floor strengthening exercise, that's lovely. But you need to ensure that those other days of the week that you're also doing exercises that are pulling from those other principles from that VAB3 method. Now, I know I've talked a lot about how to decide exercises, but let me tell you one of my most favorite, and that is doing a squat, but reaching overhead and pretending that there is a clock in front of me on the wall. So as I squat, I'm going to reach overhead to 12 o'clock, and then I'm going to return back to standing. I'm going to squat again. I'm going to reach my right arm to 1 o'clock, stand back up, put my arm back down. And then I'm going to repeat that. Obviously, some of those numbers, it's going to be difficult and it's not going to be arm overhead or above the pelvis anymore. But that is one of my favorites to do because you're getting the A for I'm getting confused with my words here. A for above the pelvis or arm overhead. You're getting B because you're using those legs. And when you're reaching in all three planes, that is going to change the load across those hips. So when you're doing a squat, typically we think, okay, my hips and my knees and my toes all need to be aligned. But if you're taking that arm and reaching it across your body as you're squatting, chances are your weight shift is going to change what's happening at that pelvis. That's where we get all the three planes. And that's one that I feel like is super easy to do. There's been times that I'll realize, oh, I haven't done any pelvic floor strengthening specific exercises in a while. And so right before bed, one of the things my husband and I do is we will watch a show. So I'll sometimes hop out of bed, or if I'm in the bathroom washing my face, I'll do some of those just so that I know, I'm not getting sweaty, it's not a huge production, and I'm able to fit some pelvic floor strengthening in. And a couple other bonus tips I'll give you here, again, is while an exercise may count as a pelvic floor strengthening exercise, like I said at the beginning, I really want to make sure that you're hitting phase 1 and phase 2 before you get to phase 3. Phase 3, I think, is the funnest. I think there's just so much creativity that's available, and there's so much variety, which muscles thrive with variety, right? Like Olympic athletes train not doing the same thing over and over. They have cross training. This is part of those principles here too. And the other piece that I'll mention as well is I want you to enjoy it. I might have mentioned exercises or yoga or running or hiking, and you're like, oh, I hate those. Okay, no problem. But you don't have to change up your entire workout. I want you to actually enjoy it. And I think that these should be a really great starting place. And if you're needing any help with any of this, or you're not sure what phase you need to start with, then consider scheduling a Your Pelvic Floor's Next Step call with me, or filling out the Your Pelvic Floor's Next Step form. Either works just fine with me. And the other thing that I will suggest for you as well is if you're looking for some variety and you're like, oh, I really love this. One of my programs inside No Kegels University, it's called Your Pelvic Floor Your Way, and it actually gives you a wide variety of the different types of ways that you can pair exercises. In fact, I share with you one of the formulas that I use to create a lot of the pelvic floor strengthening exercises inside my programs, and that allows you to make thousands and thousands of exercises with this particular formula that I share inside this program. So go ahead and take a look. I often call it the DIY, but it's called Your Pelvic Floor Your Way. DIY your own pelvic floor strengthening program. It does also walk you through phase 1 and phase 2, but phase 3, if you like to get creative and really want to know and have a good understanding, then this is a really great fit for you. Now, I also want you to remember that you're an heiress and a queen and everything in between. See you in the next one.